the invisible weapon, psychological warfare, in World War II ***. War is often imagined as a clash of weapons, armies, and machines. Tanks roll across battlefields, aircraft roar through the skies, and artillery reshapes the land. Yet during World War II, one of the most powerful weapons was neither loud nor visible. It did not explode, and it left no physical wounds. Instead, it targeted the human mind. This weapon was psychological warfare. Psychological warfare, or Psy-War, aimed not to destroy the enemy's body, but to break their will. It sought to weaken morale, create fear, spread doubt, and ultimately convince soldiers that continuing the fight was pointless. Among all the tools used for psychological warfare during World War II, one stood out for its simplicity and effectiveness: propaganda leaflets. These small pieces of paper, dropped from the sky or secretly distributed near enemy lines, carried messages designed to undermine confidence, question loyalty, and plant seeds of despair. To modern observers, they may appear harmless or even crude. But for soldiers living under constant stress, exhaustion, hunger, and fear, these leaflets could become dangerously persuasive. To understand why propaganda leaflets were so effective, we must first understand the psychological state of soldiers during World War II. Most soldiers were not ideologically driven fanatics. They were ordinary men, often young, taken from civilian life, and placed into extreme conditions. They faced long periods of boredom followed by moments of intense terror. They were separated from their families, uncertain about survival, and surrounded by death. In such conditions, morale became fragile. High morale could mean courage, discipline, and resilience. Low morale could lead to hesitation, desertion, surrender, or collapse. Military leaders quickly realized that destroying enemy morale could be just as decisive as destroying enemy divisions. This realization was not entirely new. Psychological warfare had existed for centuries. Ancient armies used intimidation, rumors, and deception to frighten opponents. However, World War II marked the first time psychological warfare was conducted on a truly industrial and global scale. Advances in printing, aviation, and mass communication allowed governments to reach millions of enemy soldiers directly. Aircraft could drop thousands of leaflets in a single mission. Radios could broadcast propaganda across borders. Messages could be carefully crafted by psychologists, linguists, and intelligence officers. Leaflets, in particular, had several advantages. First, they were cheap to produce. Compared to bombs or artillery shells, leaflets cost almost nothing. Second, they were non-lethal, which made them politically acceptable and morally easier to justify. Third, they allowed for precise psychological targeting. Messages could be adapted to specific units, nationalities, or battlefield situations. Most importantly, leaflets spoke directly to the individual soldier. Unlike radio broadcasts, which could be ignored or banned, a leaflet landed at a soldier's feet. He could pick it up, read it privately, and reflect on its message. Even if he wanted to dismiss it, the words had already entered his mind. The content of these leaflets was carefully designed. Some leaflets focused on fear. They described overwhelming enemy power, massive troop numbers, or unstoppable weapons. They warned soldiers that resistance was futile and that death was inevitable. Other leaflets focused on hopelessness. They emphasized isolation, suggesting that reinforcements would never arrive or that the war was already lost. Maps and statistics were often included to make the message appear factual and authoritative. A particularly powerful category targeted homesickness and family. These leaflets reminded soldiers of their wives, children, and parents waiting at home. They questioned whether sacrificing one's life was worth it, especially when political leaders were portrayed as corrupt, incompetent, or indifferent to soldiers' suffering. Some leaflets even included safe conduct passes, promising fair treatment, food, and medical care to soldiers who surrendered. These passes often looked official, stamped with insignia and written in clear, polite language. However, propaganda leaflets were not always negative or threatening. In many cases, they spoke like a concerned friend rather than an enemy. This approach was often more effective, as it avoided triggering immediate resistance. The goal was not necessarily to force immediate surrender, but to plant doubt. Doubt is a slow poison. Once a soldier begins to question the purpose of the war, the honesty of his leaders, or the chances of survival, his effectiveness declines. He may hesitate in combat, disobey orders, or mentally withdraw. Even if he continues fighting, his performance suffers. Military planners understood this well. In World War II, all major powers invested heavily in psychological warfare units. Britain established the Political Warfare Executive. The United States created the Office of War Information and specialized military psychological operations teams. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan developed their own propaganda departments, each shaped by ideology and culture. Although these nations differed politically and morally, they shared a common belief: the human mind was a battlefield. This chapter serves as an introduction to that battlefield. In the chapters that follow, we will examine how different countries designed and used propaganda leaflets, what messages they spread, and how effective these campaigns truly were. We will analyze real examples of leaflets dropped over Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. We will explore the science behind fear, persuasion, and morale, and we will hear testimonies from soldiers who encountered these messages firsthand. Most importantly, we will ask a crucial question: can words really kill the fighting spirit of a soldier? World War II suggests that they can. Psychological warfare did not replace guns and bombs, but it shaped the conditions under which those weapons were used. It influenced decisions, shortened resistance, and in some cases saved lives by encouraging surrender instead of prolonged combat. By understanding how propaganda leaflets worked during World War II, we gain insight not only into the past, but also into the present. Modern information warfare, disinformation campaigns, and psychological operations follow many of the same principles developed during this conflict. The paper leaflets of World War II may seem outdated, but their legacy remains powerful. This was the invisible war within the war, and it began with a simple piece of paper falling silently from the sky. Inside the soldier's mind, why propaganda worked ***. To understand why propaganda leaflets were so effective during World War II, it is essential to understand the psychological condition of the soldiers who encountered them. These men were not abstract symbols of patriotism or ideology. They were human beings placed under extraordinary stress, facing conditions that slowly eroded mental resilience. World War II soldiers lived with constant uncertainty. Unlike civilians, they had little control over their daily lives or their futures. Orders arrived suddenly. Battles could begin without warning. A quiet night could turn into chaos within seconds. This unpredictability created a permanent state of tension. Fear was not limited to combat itself. It existed before and after the fighting. Soldiers feared artillery they could not see, aircraft they could not reach, and enemies hidden beyond the horizon. They feared injury, capture, and death, but just as powerful was the fear of meaninglessness. Many wondered whether their suffering truly mattered. Psychological warfare planners understood this environment well. They knew that propaganda did not need to invent new fears. Instead, it could amplify the fears that already existed. This was the foundation of effective propaganda. Military psychologists later observed that a soldier under prolonged stress becomes mentally vulnerable. Exhaustion reduces critical thinking, repetition dulls emotional defenses. Isolation weakens confidence. When soldiers are physically tired and emotionally strained, they become more open to suggestion. Propaganda leaflets were designed to enter the mind at exactly this moment. One of the most important psychological principles behind leaflet warfare was cognitive dissonance. Soldiers were trained to believe in victory, honor, and duty. But their lived experience often contradicted these beliefs. They saw comrades die. They endured harsh conditions. They witnessed chaos and confusion rather than clear progress. Leaflets exploited this contradiction. They highlighted the gap between official promises and battlefield reality. They asked why the war continued despite enormous losses. They questioned whether leaders truly understood or cared about the suffering of frontline soldiers. These questions were dangerous not because they were entirely new, but because soldiers had already asked them silently. Another key factor was emotional isolation. World War II separated soldiers from their families for years. Letters from home were rare and often censored. News travelled slowly. Many soldiers felt disconnected from civilian life and unsure whether they were still remembered. Propaganda leaflets directly targeted this emotional distance. Some leaflets mentioned cities, villages, or regions familiar to the soldiers. Others referred to wives, children, or parents waiting at home. By doing so, they forced soldiers to mentally leave the battlefield and return, even briefly, to civilian life. This contrast was painful. The battlefield suddenly felt colder, harsher, and more meaningless when compared to memories of home. Once this emotional shift occurred, morale weakened. Propaganda also relied heavily on authority and credibility. Effective leaflets rarely appeared emotional or aggressive. Instead, they adopted a calm, rational tone. Statistics were presented. Maps were shown. Casualty numbers were listed. The language was often factual, even polite. This approach made the message seem trustworthy. When a leaflet calmly stated that an army was surrounded, or that reinforcements were impossible, it appeared more believable than loud threats or insults. Even if the information was exaggerated or false, the presentation mattered. The goal was not immediate surrender. The goal was doubt. Doubt operates quietly. A soldier may continue following orders, but his confidence is reduced. He may hesitate before advancing. He may question risky commands. Over time, this hesitation spreads. Commanders feared this effect deeply. A unit with low morale could collapse suddenly, not because it was destroyed physically, but because it lost the will to resist. History shows that many military defeats occur psychologically before they occur tactically. Propaganda leaflets also exploited group psychology. Soldiers rarely think only as individuals. They think as members of units. Leaflets often suggested that other soldiers had already surrendered or stopped believing in the war. Even when untrue, this implication was powerful. Humans naturally look to others for cues. If a soldier believed that others were losing faith, his own confidence weakened. This created a dangerous chain reaction. In some cases, leaflets included surrender instructions or safe conduct pass. These were not always intended to be used immediately. Their presence alone suggested that surrender was an acceptable, even reasonable, option. Once surrender becomes imaginable, resistance becomes la lutte. It is important to note that propaganda did not affect all soldiers equally. Ideologically committed troops, elite units, or soldiers fighting defensively near their homeland were often more resistant. However, even among these groups, prolonged exposure could still have an effect. Psychological warfare planners measured success not by total collapse, but by gradual erosion. If a leaflet caused one soldier to hesitate, it was successful. If it caused a unit to slow down, it was successful. If it caused a commander to worry about morale, it was successful. In this way, propaganda acted like pressure rather than force. World War II demonstrated that modern warfare was not only a contest of firepower, but a contest of endurance. Armies that could maintain morale gained a critical advantage. Those that lost it, even briefly, became vulnerable. Leaflets were a small part of this larger struggle, but they represented something new, a direct psychological connection between enemy, governments, and individual soldiers. For the first time in history, a soldier could be fighting on the front line while reading words written by the enemy specifically for him. This was revolutionary. In the next chapter, we will examine how these psychological principles were applied in practice. We will explore real propaganda leaflets used during World War II, analyze their language and imagery, and uncover how different nations tailored their messages too. Specific enemies. The war for the mind had rules, strategies, and objectives, and it was fought one sentence at a time. Paper weapons. How propaganda leaflets were designed ***. Propaganda leaflets used in World War II may appear simple at first glance. They were often just small pieces of paper, printed in black and white, sometimes with crude images and short texts. However, behind each leaflet was a carefully planned psychological strategy. These were not random messages. They were weapons. Every effective propaganda leaflet began with one central question: who is the target? Psychological warfare planners understood that a single message could not influence everyone equally. German soldiers, British soldiers, American soldiers, and Japanese soldiers lived in different cultures. They had different values, fears, and motivations. As a result, propaganda leaflets were never universal. They were highly specific. Language was the first consideration. Leaflets were always written in the enemy's native language. Poor translation reduced credibility and effectiveness. To avoid this, intelligence units employed linguists, native speakers, and even defectors. A leaflet written in perfect, natural language felt unsettling. It suggested deep understanding. It suggested proximity. This alone could create discomfort. Tone was equally important. Early propaganda efforts often relied on insults and threats. These messages usually failed. They triggered anger and resistance instead of doubt. By World War II, psychological warfare had evolved. Effective leaflets adopted a calm, rational, almost sympathetic tone. They spoke to soldiers, not at them. Many leaflets avoided emotional language entirely. They used facts, numbers, and simple statements. For example, a leaflet might list recent battlefield losses. It might show a map highlighting enemy encirclement. It might quote official radio broadcasts from the soldier's own government. Message was subtle but powerful. This is not our opinion. This is your reality. Visual design also played a crucial role. Images were used carefully. Too much violence could shock the reader into rejection. Too little imagery made the leaflet forgettable. Many leaflets used photographs rather than drawings. Photographs appeared objective and truthful. They showed destroyed equipment, captured soldiers, or large troop formations. Even when staged, photographs carried authority. Typography mattered as well. Official-looking fonts, seals, and stamps were often used to imitate military documents. This made leaflets appear legitimate. Some even resembled orders or reports. This visual familiarity reduced suspicion. Another powerful design choice was brevity. Propaganda leaflets were not long essays. They respected the reader's mental state. A soldier under stress would not read long texts. Messages were short. Sentences were clear. Ideas were repeated. Repetition reinforced. Memory. Many leaflets focused on a single message rather than multiple arguments. For example, you are surrounded. Your leaders have abandoned you. This war is already lost. These messages were designed to linger. Distribution methods were just as important as design. Leaflets were delivered in several ways. Aircraft drops were the most common. Bombers and fighters released bundles of leaflets over enemy territory. The slow descent of paper had a psychological effect of its own. Unlike bombs, leaflets fell silently. They could be seen drifting through the air. This created curiosity. Some soldiers instinctively picked them up, others were ordered not to read them. But banning something often increased interest. Leaflets were also fired using artillery shells modified to burst mid-air. This allowed precise delivery to frontline positions. Insomikaze's leaflets were placed secretly near supply routes or abandoned positions. Timing was critical. Leaflets were most effective after defeats, retreats, or heavy casualties. They were also used before major offensives. The goal was to weaken resistance at the right moment. Psychological warfare units closely followed battlefield developments. Messages were updated constantly. If a city fell, leaflets mentioned it immediately. If a famous unit was destroyed, its name appeared in print. Speed increased credibility. One of the most effective leaflet categories was the Safe Conduct Pass. Spasis promised humane treatment for soldiers who surrendered. They often included instructions on how to approach enemy lines safely. Food, medical care, and survival were emphasized. The wording was polite and respectful. The enemy was presented not as cruel, but as reasonable. This was intentional. Fear of mistreatment was one of the biggest barriers to surrender. Safe conduct passes reduced that fear. Even if a soldier never used the pass, knowing it existed mattered. It changed the mental landscape. Another common leaflet strategy was contrast. Leaflets contrasted the soldiers' suffering with the comfort of leaders. They suggested that politicians and officers lived safely while ordinary men died. This message resonated strongly. Throughout history, soldiers have tolerated hardship when they believe it is shared. When they believe it is unfair, morale collapses. Propaganda leaflets exploited this perception skillfully. It is important to understand that leaflet designers did not expect instant results. They expected gradual effects. Each leaflet was one small psychological push. One moment of hesitation, one seed of doubt. Over time, these small effects accumulated. World War II marked a turning point in how warfare was understood. Military success no longer depended only on weapons and numbers. It depended on perception, belief, and morale. Propaganda leaflets represented the industrialization of psychological influence. They were mass-produced. Were strategically deployed. They were scientifically designed. In the next chapter, we will examine specific historical examples. We will analyze real leaflets used by Allied and Axis powers. We will explore what they said, how they looked, and how soldiers reacted. Only then can we fully understand how paper became a weapon of war. Messages from the sky. Propaganda leaflets in the European War ****. The European theatre of World War II became the largest testing ground for psychological warfare. Millions of soldiers from different nations fought across vast territories. This diversity created ideal conditions for targeted propaganda. Propaganda leaflets flooded the skies over Europe. They fell on cities, forests, trenches, and battlefields. They landed in occupied territories and active combat zones. In some areas, soldiers encountered leaflets almost as often as artillery fire. Both Allied and Axis powers invested heavily in leaflet operations. Nazi Germany began using leaflets early in the war. British and French forces responded soon after. Later, the United States expanded these efforts on an industrial scale. Each side believed strongly in the power of words. One of the earliest German leaflet campaigns targeted British troops during the Battle of France in 1940. These leaflets claimed that resistance was pointless. They emphasized German military strength and rapid victories. Maps were often included. Arrows showed advancing German units. British forces were depicted as surrounded and isolated. The message was clear: this war is already decided. However, early German leaflets often relied too much on arrogance. They praised German superiority openly. They mocked enemy forces. In many cases de occupage, British soldiers often reacted with anger rather than fear. Mockery strengthened resolve instead of weakening it. The British learned from this mistake quickly. British propaganda leaflets adopted a different tone. They were calm, they were factual. They avoided insults. During the air war over Germany, British aircraft dropped millions of leaflets on German soldiers and civilians. These leaflets often contained official-looking reports. One common theme was truth-based propaganda. Rather than exaggerating, British leaflets frequently used accurate information. They reported real bombing damage. They listed actual cities destroyed by air raids. They quoted statements from German radio broadcasts. This strategy built credibility. When soldiers saw that the leaflets matched their own observations, trust increased. Once trust existed, persuasion became easier. American forces later adopted and expanded this method. The United States created specialized psychological warfare units composed of writers, artists, psychologists, and intelligence officers. These teams studied German culture in detail. American leaflets often focused on inevitability. They emphasized overwhelming industrial power. They highlighted endless waves of Allied troops. They portrayed defeat as certain and unavoidable. Importantly, these leaflets avoided demonizing the ordinary German soldier. Instead, blame was placed on political leadership. This separation was deliberate. By reducing personal hostility, the leaflets made surrender feel less shameful. Another effective European leaflet theme was division. Allied leaflets emphasized differences between German soldiers and the Nazi elite. Hey suggested that high-ranking officials lived comfortably while frontline troops suffered. Some leaflets showed images of luxury homes, banquets, or safe offices. These were contrasted with images of muddy trenches and destroyed villages. The implication was subtle but powerful. This is not your war. German soldiers reading these messages were forced to confront uncomfortable questions. Why continue fighting if victory was impossible? Why die for leaders who would survive? In occupied territories, leaflets served a slightly different purpose. They encouraged resistance movements. They spread information about Allied advances. They reassured civilians that liberation was coming. Although aimed primarily at civilians, these messages indirectly affected enemy soldiers as well. A hostile population increased stress and insecurity among occupying forces. As the war progressed, leaflet campaigns became more sophisticated. During the final months of the war, Allied leaflets explicitly offered surrender as a rational choice. Safe conduct passes became common. These passes promised food, shelter, and medical treatment. They emphasized compliance with international law. Many German soldiers kept these passes hidden in their uniforms. Even if they did not surrender immediately, the option existed. The psychological impact was significant. German commanders reported declining morale. Desertions increased. Units surrendered more quickly in late war engagements. While military defeat was the primary cause, psychological pressure accelerated collapse. It is important to note that propaganda leaflets did not operate in isolation. They worked alongside military advances. Words alone rarely ended battles. But words combined with defeat could end wars faster. The European theatre demonstrated a critical lesson. Effective propaganda must align with reality. When propaganda matched lived experience, it gained power. When it contradicted reality, it failed. By 1945, psychological warfare in Europe had matured into a refined system. It was planned, measured, and evaluated. Leaflets had become a standard military tool. In the next chapter, we will move away from Europe and examine a very different environment. The Pacific War presented unique psychological challenges. Culture, honor, and surrender carried different meanings, and propaganda had to adapt. A different battlefield, psychological warfare, in the Pacific ***. The Pacific War of World. Water presented a completely different psychological environment. The geography was different, the cultures were different, and the meaning of surrender was fundamentally different. Unlike the European theatre, where surrender was generally accepted as a military outcome, the Pacific War was shaped by extreme ideas of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. This difference forced psychological warfare planners to rethink everything. Japanese soldiers were trained to believe that surrender was shameful. Many were taught that capture was worse than death. This belief was reinforced by military doctrine, education, and social pressure. As a result, traditional propaganda methods often failed. Early Allied leaflets that encouraged surrender were simply ignored. Some were destroyed immediately. Others were used as toilet paper or fuel. This reaction confused Allied planners at first. They assumed that fear of death would outweigh ideology. They were wrong. In the Pacific, fear alone was not enough. Japanese soldiers often feared disgrace more than death. Propaganda that relied on intimidation or threats had little effect. This forced a strategic shift. Allied psychological warfare units began to study Japanese culture deeply. Anthropologists, linguists, and cultural experts were consulted. Messages were redesigned from the ground up. One major change was tone. Leaflets became more respectful. They avoided insults completely. They emphasized empathy rather than dominance. Another change involved language and symbolism. Japanese leaflets were written in formal, respectful Japanese. Honorific expressions were used carefully. Messages avoided direct criticism of the emperor, who remained a sacred figure. Instead, propaganda focused on practical realities. Leaflets described the hopeless military situation honestly. They emphasized shortages of food and medicine. They highlighted the overwhelming industrial power of the United States. Importantly, these leaflets framed surrender not as cowardice, but as survival. They argued that living to rebuild Japan was more honorable than dying meaninglessly. This reframing was subtle, but critical. One particularly effective tactic involved personalization. Some leaflets addressed soldiers directly. They referred to them as sons, brothers, and husbands. They reminded them of families waiting at home. This emotional appeal was powerful. In the isolation of warfare, memories of home became vivid. The contrast between family life and brutal conditions weakened resolve. Allied forces also adapted the use of safe conduct passes. These passes were redesigned to look official and respectful. They promised humane treatment and medical care. They often included statements assuring soldiers that surrender would not bring dishonor to their families. Still, surrender rates remained low compared to Europe. However, propaganda in the Pacific achieved success in other ways. It reduced the intensity of resistance in some areas. It encouraged hesitation. It saved lives during specific engagements. One notable example occurred during the later stages of island campaigns. Leaflets were dropped warning civilians and soldiers of upcoming attacks. They explained evacuation routes and safety measures. Although controversial, this approach reduced civilian casualties and created confusion among defenders. Radio propaganda also played a significant role. Allied broadcasts in Japanese targeted isolated units. They provided news, music, and commentary. This created a sense of connection to the outside world. Some soldiers listened secretly at night. The psychological effect was gradual but real. As the war neared its end, propaganda intensified. Leaflets described Japan's deteriorating situation. They mentioned cities destroyed by bombing. They highlighted the impossibility of continued resistance. After the atomic bombings, leaflet campaigns became even more direct. Messages warned of further destruction. They urged leaders to surrender to prevent total annihilation. These messages reached not only soldiers, but civilians as well. While propaganda alone did not end the Pacific War, it shaped the conditions under which surrender became possible. The Pacific theater demonstrated an important lesson. Psychological warfare must adapt to culture. Messages that work in one society may fail completely in another. Understanding values, beliefs, and social norms is essential. In the next chapter, we will return to the perspective of the individual soldier. We will examine how soldiers actually reacted to propaganda leaflets. Did they read them? Did they believe them? Did they talk about them? And most importantly, did they change behavior? Reading the enemy's words. How soldiers reacted ***. Propaganda leaflets do not work automatically. They do not control minds. They do not force obedience. Instead, they interact with existing thoughts and emotions. To understand their real impact during World War II, we must look at how soldiers actually responded when they encountered them. The first reaction was often curiosity. When leaflets fell from the sky, many soldiers noticed them immediately. They looked different from shells and bombs. They made no sound. Some soldiers picked them up without thinking. Others hesitated, knowing they were forbidden to read them. In many armies, propaganda was officially banned. Commanders feared its influence. This ban itself revealed how seriously propaganda was taken. Despite orders, many soldiers read the leaflets anyway. They did so privately. They hid them in pockets or boots. They read them at night or during quiet moments. This secrecy increased the psychological impact. A private, reading aloud reflection without social pressure. The soldier did not need to defend his reaction in front of others. Reactions varied widely. Soldiers laughed at the leaflets. They mocked poor arguments or obvious exaggerations. Humor became a defense mechanism. Others felt anger. They saw the leaflets as insults or lies. This reaction often strengthened short-term resistance. However, the most important reactions were quieter. Many soldiers felt unease. Even when a leaflet was dismissed outwardly, its message often lingered. A soldier might reject the words, but still remember a specific sentence, a number, a map, a claim about a lost battle. Over time, these fragments accumulated. Psychological warfare rarely produced immediate surrender. Its power lay in repetition. Soldiers encountered similar messages again and again. Each leaflet reinforced earlier doubts. Another common reaction was discussion. Leaflets became topics of conversation within units. Soldiers compared messages with rumors and personal observations. If a leaflet mentioned a destroyed unit, and a soldier had already noticed missing reinforcements, the message gained credibility. Group discussion amplified effects. One soldier's doubt could spread to others. This social dynamic worried commanders greatly. Some units responded by organizing counter-propaganda. Officers explained why the leaflets were lies. They emphasized discipline and loyalty. These efforts sometimes worked. But constant explanation also revealed insecurity. When leaders repeatedly deny something, soldiers begin to ask why. In certain situations, leaflets directly influenced behavior. During late-war European battles, some German soldiers used safe conduct passes to surrender. They did not always trust the enemy fully, but they trusted survival more. Captured soldiers often admitted that leaflets had influenced their decision, not as the sole reason, but as confirmation that surrender was possible. In the Pacific, reactions were different but still meaningful. Many Japanese soldiers rejected leaflets entirely, but some kept them secretly. These soldiers did not surrender immediately. However, when wounded, isolated, or starving, the memory of the leaflet returned. In these moments, propaganda became relevant. It provided an alternative to death. Another reaction was emotional conflict. Soldiers felt torn between duty and self-preservation. Leaflets intensified this internal struggle. A soldier might continue fighting, but with reduced confidence. This change was subtle, but militarily significant. Commanders reported increased hesitation, slower advances, and greater concern about morale. These effects were difficult to measure, but they were real. Importantly, propaganda also affected soldiers indirectly. When leaflets targeted civilians, soldiers observed changes in civilian behavior. Occupied populations became more resistant. Information spread more quickly. Trust in occupying forces declined. This created a hostile environment for enemy troops. Psychological pressure increased from all sides. Not all soldiers were affected. Highly motivated units, elite formations, and soldiers fighting defensively near home often resisted propaganda more effectively. However, even these soldiers were not immune indefinitely. Fatigue weakens everyone. World War II demonstrated that psychological warfare works best when combined with military pressure. Leaflets alone rarely caused surrender, but leaflets plus defeat were powerful. The mind breaks more easily when reality supports the message. By the end of the war, military analysts recognized propaganda leaflets as a legitimate weapon. They did not replace guns or bombs, but they shaped how those weapons were experienced. They influenced decisions at critical moments. They saved lives by encouraging surrender. They shortened battles. In the next chapter, we will examine the organizations behind these operations, who designed these messages, who decided what to say and when. Psychological warfare was not improvised. It was planned. The architects of doubt, who created psychological warfare ***. Psychological warfare in World War II did not happen by accident. It was not the result of random creativity or spontaneous ideas. It was planned. Behind every leaflet, behind every sentence, stood an organized system of specialists. This invisible army rarely appeared on the battlefield, yet its influence reached every front. These were the architects of doubt. In the early years of World War II, most nations were unprepared for large-scale psychological warfare. They understood propaganda in a political sense, but not yet as a military weapon that changed quickly. Britain was among the first to institutionalize psychological warfare. In 1939, it established the Political Warfare Executive, often called the PWE. The PWE brought together an unusual mix of people: journalists, writers, psychologists, artists, intelligence officers. Their mission was simple to describe, but difficult to execute: weaken the enemy's will to fight. The PWE studied enemy societies in detail. They analyzed newspapers, radio broadcasts, and speeches. They searched for contradictions, weaknesses, and fears. Every leaflet had to align with known realities. Falsehoods were avoided when possible. Credibility was considered more valuable than shock. This approach shaped Allied psychological warfare for the rest of the war. The United States entered the war with less experience, but with enormous resources. In 1942, the US government created the Office of War Information, or WWII. Within the military, specialized psychological warfare divisions were formed. American Psy-War units expanded rapidly. They operated in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Like the British, the Americans relied on interdisciplinary teams. Psychologists studied stress and persuasion. Sociologists examined group behavior. Linguists ensured accurate language. For the first time, warfare openly incorporated behavioral science. This was a turning point. Germany also invested heavily in propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda Power. German psychological warfare emphasized ideology and national pride. Early efforts relied heavily on confidence and superiority. However, this approach had limits. German propaganda often underestimated enemy resilience. It sometimes relied on exaggeration rather than credibility. As the war turned against Germany, the gap between propaganda and reality widened. This reduced effectiveness. Japan's psychological warfare reflected its own cultural priorities. Japanese propaganda focused on honor, sacrifice, and loyalty. It emphasized moral superiority rather than material strength. Messages were often rigid and formal. This style resonated internally, but struggled to influence foreign audiences. Over time, Japanese Psy-War units attempted adaptation, but cultural barriers remained significant. One of the most important lessons of World War II was organizational. Effective psychological warfare required coordination. Leaflet designers needed real-time battlefield information. Writers needed accurate intelligence. Distribution teams needed precise timing. This required close cooperation between intelligence agencies and military commands. When coordination failed, propaganda failed. Psychological warfare units also faced ethical dilemmas. They were tasked with deception, but excessive lying destroyed credibility. They aimed to encourage surrender, but they could not guarantee perfect treatment of prisoners. This tension was constant. Many Psy-War officers argued that truthful propaganda was the most ethical and effective approach. Others believed manipulation was justified by the goal of ending war sooner. These debates continue today. Despite differences, all Psy-War units shared a common understanding. Morale was a strategic resource. Destroying factories weakened armies. Destroying morale weakened nations. By the later stages of the war, psychological warfare had become professionalized. Operations were planned months in advance. Messages were tested internally. Results were analyzed through prisoner interrogations and battlefield reports. Success was measured carefully. Not in immediate surrender, but in reduced resistance, slower responses, and increased desertion. Psychological warfare also influenced military decision-making. Commanders considered morale when planning offensives. Leaflets were dropped before attacks, radio broadcasts intensified during sieges. The mental battlefield became integrated with the physical one. Many Psy-War specialists remained anonymous. Their names rarely appear in history books, yet their work shaped outcomes. They demonstrated that modern war required more than force. It required understanding the enemy's mind. World War II marked the birth of psychological warfare as a permanent military discipline. After the war, many Psy-War veterans influenced Cold War information campaigns. Their methods evolved. But their principles remained. The architects of doubt proved that ideas could weaken armies. In the next chapter, we will examine the limits of psychological warfare. When did propaganda fail? Why did some soldiers remain immune? And what lessons were learned from those failures? When words failed, the limits of psychological warfare ***. Psychological warfare in World War II was powerful. But it was not unlimited. Propaganda leaflets did not always work. In some situations, they failed completely. Understanding these failures is just as important as studying success. One of the most important limits of propaganda was reality. No message, no matter how well written, could permanently override lived experience. When propaganda contradicted what soldiers saw with their own eyes, it lost credibility. Early in the war, many leaflet campaigns relied on exaggeration. Promised quick victory, they predicted immediate collapse. When these predictions failed, soldiers became more skeptical. Once trust was broken, future messages lost power. This lesson was learned repeatedly. Another major limit was strong ideology. Some soldiers were deeply committed to political or religious beliefs. For them, propaganda messages did not create doubt. Instead, they reinforced resistance, Nazi ideological units, fanatical formations, and some elite forces. Less affected by leaflet campaigns. In the Pacific, this effect was even stronger. Japanese soldiers trained under strict codes of honor often rejected propaganda instinctively. For them, surrender was morally unacceptable. No leaflet could easily change that belief. Culture acted as armor. Group pressure was another powerful barrier. Soldiers rarely thought as isolated individuals. They belonged to units, shared danger, and depended on one another. Reading propaganda privately was one thing, or acting on it publicly was another. Fear of judgment from comrades often outweighed fear of death. A soldier might believe the message, but still continue fighting. Propaganda could weaken morale, but not always behavior. Leadership also played a critical role. Strong, respected officers could neutralize propaganda effects when commanders maintained discipline, addressed fears openly, and shared hardship with their troops. Leaflets lost influence. Conversely, poor leadership amplified propaganda impact. This difference explained why similar leaflet campaigns produced different results in different units. Timing was another limitation. Propaganda was most effective during defeat, retreat, or isolation. When soldiers were advancing or winning, leaflets had little impact. Victory created psychological immunity. This is why Psy-War units closely followed battlefield conditions. Mistimed messages were wasted. Information overload also reduced effectiveness. Areas with constant leaflet drops. Soldiers became desensitized. Messages blurred together. Paper lost novelty. Without variation or relevance, leaflets became background noise. Another limitation involved fear-based messaging. Extreme threats sometimes backfired when propaganda emphasized inevitable death. Some soldiers responded with fatalism, if death was certain. Why surrender? In these cases, fear hardened resistance instead of weakening it. This forced Psy-War planners to adopt more balanced approaches. Ethical boundaries also limited operations. Some proposed propaganda strategies were rejected because they risked violating international law or damaging post-war reconciliation. For example, spreading false surrender orders could have caused chaos, but also undermined long-term trust. Psychological warfare existed within moral constraints. Even during total war, there were also limits of measurement. Unlike physical destruction, psychological effects were difficult to quantify. Commanders wanted clear results. Psychological warfare offered probabilities. This uncertainty made some military leaders skeptical. Despite these limits, failure did not mean irrelevance. Psychological warfare rarely worked alone. It worked best as part of a larger system. When military pressure, logistical shortages, and battlefield losses aligned with propaganda messages, effects multiplied. When they did not, propaganda struggled. World War II taught an important lesson: psychological warfare cannot create defeat. It can only accelerate it. Words cannot replace force, but they can shape how force is perceived. This understanding influenced post-war doctrine deeply. Military planners became more realistic. They accepted limits. They refined methods. In the next chapter, we will examine the long-term impact of World War II's psychological warfare. How did these experiences shape modern information warfare? What lessons continue to influence conflicts today? The paper leaflets of World War II may be gone, but the battle for the human mind continues. The legacy of psychological warfare. Lessons from World War II***. World War II ended in 1945. But the lessons of psychological warfare did not disappear with the last battles. The strategies developed. The research conducted and the experiences gained became the foundation for modern information operations. One of the most significant legacies was the professionalization of Psy-War. During the war, teams of psychologists, linguists, and social scientists worked closely with military planners. After the war, many of these experts continued their work. They advised governments, trained military officers, and refined methods of influence. The principles developed during World War II shaped Cold War operations. Leaflets may have become less central, but radio broadcasts, pamphlets, and eventually digital media carried forward the same logic. Credibility remained critical. Understanding the target remained essential. Timing and cultural sensitivity were still decisive. Another legacy was the emphasis on morale as a strategic resource. Military planners learned that morale could be measured, influenced, and manipulated. High morale could multiply the effectiveness of troops. Low morale could collapse armies faster than weapons ever could. This insight influenced doctrine, training, and operational planning in both NATO and Warsaw Pact armies. World War II also demonstrated the ethical complexities of psychological warfare. Propaganda was inherently deceptive, but it could also save lives by encouraging surrender instead of prolonged combat. This tension shaped post-war rules of engagement and international law. Leaflet campaigns taught military leaders that influence was most effective when aligned with reality. False promises could backfire, but truth-based messaging often worked. Soldiers' reactions during World War II provided enduring lessons. Curiosity, secrecy, group discussion, and emotional conflict were all part of how propaganda interacted with human psychology. Modern operations continue to consider these factors. Psychological warfare also influenced civilian-targeted operations. During World War II, leaflets, broadcasts, and other messaging reached occupied populations. This increased resistance, created tension among enemy forces, and influenced the broader social environment. Today, similar principles are applied in information campaigns and psychological operations peace, WWII, in modern conflicts. The technological evolution from paper to digital platforms has expanded reach, but the core lessons remain. Another important legacy was cultural adaptation. World War II demonstrated that messages must reflect the target's values, beliefs, and social norms. What worked in Europe often failed in the Pacific. Messages that ignored culture were ignored, rejected, or counterproductive. This principle is central to modern psychological operations. It emphasizes that one-size-fits-all messaging is ineffective. World War II also established a methodology for measuring effectiveness. Psy-war units collected intelligence, observed reactions, and adjusted messages accordingly. This iterative approach resembles modern marketing, but applied to strategic influence. The war also highlighted the human dimension of warfare. Weapons destroy bodies. Psychological operations influence minds. Both necessary to win modern conflicts. Many of the veterans of World War II Psy-war units went on to advise post-war governments. They helped shape NATO's psychological operations doctrine, US Army field manuals, and other military publications. The ethical and practical lessons of World War II remain relevant. Leaders today understand that propaganda can be both powerful and fragile. Credibility, timing, and audience perception determine success. Without these elements, even the most sophisticated campaign may fail. Finally, the legacy of World War II psychological warfare is also educational. Historians, social scientists, and military professionals study it to understand human behavior under extreme conditions. The war provided a vast laboratory for observing how fear, hope, doubt, and morale interact. The paper leaflets that once drifted over battlefields may be gone, but the ideas they carried and the lessons they taught continue to influence military strategy, diplomacy, and internationales relations. In the next chapter, we will conclude the series by summarizing key lessons and reflecting on the enduring importance of psychological warfare. We will consider how these lessons apply not only to military contexts, but to broader human conflict and persuasion. The war for the mind, begun with simple pieces of paper, continues in new forms today. The final battle, lessons from psychological warfare, in World War II ***. World War II was fought not only with guns, tanks, and bombs. It was also fought with words, ideas, and carefully crafted messages. The leaflets, broadcasts, and messages that reached soldiers and civilians alike were instruments of influence, tools designed to shape perception and to manipulate morale. As we conclude this series, it is important to reflect on what these campaigns taught us. First, psychological warfare is a force multiplier. One leaflet alone rarely ends a battle, but combined with military action, strategic timing, and real-world conditions, words can accelerate defeat. Encourage sur des lives. The power of ideas in warfare is clear. Second, understanding the human mind is essential. World War II Psy-war operations depended on a deep knowledge of psychology. Soldiers' fears, hopes, and cultural beliefs were all analyzed before messages were crafted. Curiosity, secrecy, group dynamics, and emotional conflict determined the impact of propaganda. Modern operations still rely on these principles, whether in military, diplomatic, or even commercial contexts. Third, credibility matters more than deception. Early experiments in exaggerated propaganda often failed. Soldiers rejected obvious lies. Credibility was fragile but essential. Messages that aligned with observed reality were the most effective. This is a lesson that transcends time. Fourth, context and culture are critical. European soldiers reacted differently from Japanese soldiers. Values, social norms, and cultural conditioning influenced how messages were received. Propaganda must be adapted to the audience. Ignoring culture can render a campaign ineffective or even counterproductive. Fifth, morale is a strategic resource. Physical resources, guns, ammunition, vehicles are visible. Morale is invisible. Yet morale can determine whether those physical resources succeed. High morale amplifies strength. Low morale can collapse units faster than any weapon. Sixth, coordination between intelligence and operations is key. Leaflets required accurate intelligence, precise timing, and effective distribution. Poor coordination reduced effectiveness. World War II demonstrated that psychological operations must be integrated with broader military strategy. Seventh, ethical considerations matter. Propaganda operates in the grey area between persuasion and manipulation. World War II planners debated the ethics of deception, fear, and influence. Even in total war, moral constraints shaped campaigns. Truth-based messaging often proved both ethical and effective. Finally, the legacy continues. The lessons learned in World War II informed the Cold War, modern psychological operations, and even digital influence campaigns today. The tools have changed from paper to radio, to television to social media, but the principles endure. World War II also reminds us that war is not only a contest of weapons, but a contest of minds. Words can inspire courage. Words can create fear. Words can change the course of battles, and sometimes the fate of nations. The leaflets that once drifted over European forests, Pacific jungles, and cities under siege represent more than a historical curiosity. They are proof that human perception is a battlefield, and that ideas can be as deadly or as life-saving as bullets. As we look back, we see the intricate dance between psychology, strategy, and human resilience. We see that even in the most violent conflicts, the mind is a primary target. We recognize that influence, carefully applied, is a powerful force. In the end, World War II psychological warfare teaches a timeless lesson. Winning the mind is as important as winning the fight. Understanding human behavior, respecting culture, maintaining credibility, and targeting morale strategically, these are principles that remain relevant today, in war and in peace. The battle for the mind did not end in 1945. It continues in every human conflict, every negotiation, every effort to persuade and influence. The leaflets may have faded. The bombs may have stopped falling, but the lessons endure, reminding us that psychological warfare, thoughtfully applied, is a force that shapes history itself.